So, you think you could handle ancient Greece? Please, you'd be sunburned, starving, and publicly shamed before lunchtime. Forget toga parties and philosophers serenading you with wisdom. This was a world where bathing was a public sport, toilet paper was a rock, and democracy only applied if you were a rich, land-owning male with a beard. Everyone else? Good luck. You try surviving a day in Athens and get dragged into a 9-hour debate about whether a tomato is a fruit, except tomatoes hadn't even been discovered yet. Then you'd stumble into Sparta, where 7-year-olds could bench more than you and kindness was considered a weakness. Want medicine? Hope you enjoy leeches and questionable herbs. Want to worship the gods? Careful, they might turn you into a tree just for fun. And did we mention you'd be doing all this in a linen sheet, barefoot, while dodging war, plague, and angry philosophers? Welcome to Why You Wouldn't Last a Day in Ancient Greece and more, where we dive deep into the grit, grime, and glory of a civilization that gave us theater, science, and the Olympics, but would chew up a modern human faster than a Spartan snack. Let's get uncomfortable. So, you've time-traveled back to ancient Greece. Congratulations! You've left behind electricity, clean water, plumbing, Google, deodorant, and every food you love. In exchange, you get sunshine, sandals, and suffering. Lots of suffering. First things first, there is no Greece as you know it. The land is chopped up into hundreds of city-states, polis, like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, all of which are constantly arguing, warring, and pretending they're better than each other. There's no central government, no unified currency, and definitely no customer service. Each polis has its own laws, customs, and dialects. You'll need a phrase book just to travel 10 miles. You're standing on rocky soil under an unforgiving sun. The Aegean Sea glistens nearby, but don't let the scenery fool you. Life here is brutal. You're about to be hurled into a society where you're either fighting, farming, or philosophizing your way through daily chaos. And unless you're a free-born male citizen, you're already starting several steps behind. Let's say, for argument's sake, you're an average guy born in Athens, because honestly, being a woman, slave, or foreigner, your options are even worse. You're probably waking up on a straw mattress in a cramped home made of sun-baked mud bricks. There's no doorbell. There's barely a door. Privacy doesn't exist. You live with your parents, siblings, and probably a goat or two. Get used to smells. Breakfast? Barley porridge if you're lucky. Coffee? Never heard of it. Water might give you parasites, so you're sipping diluted wine at 7 a.m. This is totally normal. Everyone's mildly buzzed by mid-morning. Now it's time to head out. Barefoot, of course, unless you've got the luxury of owning sandals. If you're not a landowner, you're probably off to toil in the fields under the hot sun. Your tools? Wooden, dull, and back-breaking. Don't bother hoping for weekends. They haven't been invented yet. And if you are wealthy enough not to work the land, congratulations! You've earned yourself a day of long-winded philosophical debates, sitting on stone benches discussing justice, honor, and whether shadows are real. Sounds glamorous until you realize Socrates probably hasn't showered in a month and smells like goat cheese. Thinking of going to school? If you're a boy, sure. You'll be taught reading, writing, music, and gymnastics by a pedagogos, essentially a slave who follows you around and keeps you from acting like a little jerk. If you're a girl, your curriculum: how to sew, how to serve, how to shut up. That's the full syllabus. But maybe you want a break from all this. Time to unwind? Cool, let's hit the gymnasium. But heads up, everyone is naked. Exercising in the nude is just how things are done here. You're surrounded by glistening, oiled-up bodies, and not in a fun way. You're mostly trying not to get kicked in the face by someone doing discus. Need to go to the bathroom? Great! Grab your pessoi, a nice flat shard of pottery used to scrape your behind. Toilet paper won't be invented for another 2,000 years. You'll be missing Charmin by lunchtime. And hygiene? Don't even get started. Baths happen occasionally, often in public, and the soap is basically sand mixed with ash. There's no toothpaste, so hope you enjoy the sensation of fuzzy teeth. Most people smell like sweat, wine, and garlic. Personal space is a myth. You want some entertainment? There's no TV, but you might catch a tragedy at the amphitheater. Just don't expect popcorn or comfy seats. You'll be sitting on stone for 5 hours while actors in giant masks scream in poetic Greek about fate, death, and hubris. Fun. Night falls and it's time to return home, unless you're conscripted to fight in a war. In that case, here's a 60-pound shield, a bronze helmet, and no idea where the enemy is. Try not to die. If you make it back, maybe you'll get a funeral poem. Maybe. As you collapse into your itchy, lumpy bed, you'll finally realize ancient Greece isn't the charming land of columns and genius thinkers you imagined. It's dusty, dangerous, and entirely uninterested in your modern sensibilities. And you've only survived one day. Don't worry, it gets worse. When people think of ancient Athens, they usually imagine golden sunlight, white marble columns, and bearded philosophers casually inventing democracy while sipping wine. It's easy to believe Athens was basically a liberal arts college with sandals. But guess what? If you got dropped into classical Athens, you'd last about an hour before being voted most annoying foreigner and exiled, or worse, put on trial for being weird. Let's start with the democracy part. Yes, Athens invented it. Yay, progress. But slow down there, Socrates. Only free, land-owning men over 18 could vote. That's about 10–15% of the population. If you're a woman, a slave, a medic, resident foreigner, or underage, no say, zero, nada. And even if you are eligible, being a citizen doesn't just mean voting once every 4 years. You're expected to participate. That means showing up to long-winded assembly meetings, casting votes by a show of hands, sitting on juries, and serving in office if your name gets picked, yes, randomly, like ancient democracy bingo. These jury trials, they were intense. You could be selected for jury duty one day, and the case might be as trivial as someone accusing their neighbor of stealing a fig. No judges, no lawyers, just you and hundreds of other citizens shouting at each other in a giant open-air courtroom. Verdicts were decided on the same day. Justice was fast, loud, and often ridiculous. Oh, and if you don't show up for civic duty, you might get roped in by a literal red-stained rope. Officials dragged dyed ropes through the streets to mark absent citizens with red stains. Public shaming was a motivational tool. How's that for peer pressure? Now let's talk about daily life. Athens was crowded, noisy, and surprisingly smelly. With no sanitation system and a love for open markets, the streets were packed with people, stray dogs, livestock, and every smell imaginable. Imagine Times Square, but replace the lights with blazing sun and the perfume with fish guts. You might be thinking, at least I'll blend in with the cool thinkers. Wrong. Philosophy wasn't glamorous. Socrates, that guy was considered a public menace. He wandered around barefoot, asked annoying questions, and never charged for his teaching. He literally made people question their entire existence until they stormed off. Eventually, they gave him the death penalty for corrupting the youth. So yeah, intellectual freedom had limits. Education was a luxury, and it was mostly practical: rhetoric, logic, mathematics, and music for boys, housework and silence for girls. If you couldn't afford a tutor, tough luck. Also, writing was done with a stylus on wax tablets. You mess up a sentence, scrape it off and start again. Hope your handwriting is better than your patience. The housing? Spartan. Pun fully intended. Most Athenian homes were plain on the outside and centered around a courtyard. If you're used to windows, plumbing, or doors that lock, sorry, you're out of luck. Women were often confined to the back quarters of the house, only allowed out for festivals or funerals. Not exactly the feminist utopia you were picturing, huh? Speaking of festivals, the Athenians loved them. There were religious festivals for nearly every god, and they often involved wild theater competitions, excessive drinking, and parades. Sounds fun until you realize that participation was mandatory and hangovers weren't considered a medical excuse. And don't even think about complaining. Athenians didn't have much tolerance for whining. The culture valued moderation, endurance, and loyalty to the city-state. If you insulted a god, acted like a barbarian, or tried to dodge military service, you were out, ostracized for 10 years, literally. They held a vote every year to kick out the most unpopular guy. If your name got scratched into enough pottery shards, ostraca, it was pack your sandals and get out. By now, you might be wondering how anyone actually liked living in Athens. Well, for all its flaws, it was the birthplace of amazing ideas, drama, democracy, science, and literature. But make no mistake, for the average person, it was hard, strict, and demanding. You weren't lounging on marble steps pondering the universe. You were rushing to the assembly, dodging goat poop, and hoping nobody dragged you into a lawsuit. So no, you wouldn't last long in Athens. Not unless you're ready to argue, sweat, and sacrifice your personal comfort for the glory of the polis. And that's just Athens. Wait until you meet Sparta. You think you've got grit? Think again. Welcome to Sparta, where pain is a virtue, weakness is a crime, and emotional expression is basically treason. This isn't just a city-state, it's a military boot camp disguised as a society. If you're imagining six-pack abs and dramatic slow-motion battles like in 300, you're not entirely wrong. But you're also not ready. Let's start with your birth. In Sparta, being born isn't enough. You have to earn the right to live. Shortly after birth, Spartan babies were inspected by a state council of elders. If you looked weak, sickly, or just a little off, sorry kiddo, you were abandoned on a hillside. Brutal, yes, but Sparta didn't do sentimentality. If you did survive infancy, congrats, you now belong to the state. At age 7, boys were taken from their families and placed into the agoge, a state-run education and training system designed to turn you into the ultimate soldier. Forget finger painting or recess. Your childhood involved wrestling, stealth training, barefoot long-distance runs, and learning to endure cold, hunger, and beatings without complaint. In fact, you were encouraged to steal food, but punished if you got caught. Why? Because failing at stealth was worse than starving. Oh, and your clothes? A single tunic. For the whole year. No shoes, no blankets. You were expected to sleep on reeds and shiver your way to strength. Complain about being cold? You'd be laughed at and maybe slapped. Cry? Enjoy your public shaming. Education wasn't exactly well-rounded either. Reading and writing were taught just enough to follow orders. Philosophy, art, not a priority. What mattered was discipline, loyalty, obedience, and the ability to kill without hesitation. By the time you hit your teenage years, you'd be covered in scars, both emotional and physical. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. Teen boys were paired with older male mentors. These relationships were part of a system meant to reinforce discipline and loyalty, but let's just say the social dynamics would deeply confuse a modern therapist. At 20, you'd become a full-time soldier. Spartan men remained in military service until they were 60. Even if you got married, you didn't live with your wife. You lived in the barracks. Your bros were your bunkmates, battle buddies, and lifelong companions. Romantic relationships were a bit secondary.
Speaking of romance, Spartan women had more rights than elsewhere in Greece. That's the good news. They could own property, speak publicly, and were encouraged to be physically fit. The catch? That was because their main job was to produce strong warrior sons. You weren't valued for beauty, you were valued for breeding power. And yes, girls trained too. Think crunches and javelin throws, not makeup tutorials. Spartan society was designed for war. Everything else, art, luxury, personal ambition, was seen as weakness. Money? Who cares? Spartans used heavy iron bars instead of coins, which made buying anything incredibly inconvenient. It was a clever way to discourage materialism. You weren't supposed to want stuff, You were supposed to want honor and God's help if you were an outsider. Foreigners were treated with deep suspicion. Merchants, poets, and philosophers were all unwelcome distractions from Spartan values. Even speaking too much was frowned upon. Spartans were known for their short, cutting remarks, hence the word laconic, named after Laconia, the region of Sparta. Small talk? That's for weaklings. Now let's talk about war, because Sparta was always ready. The hoplite phalanx, their famous military formation, relied on total unity and discipline. If you broke ranks, you didn't just endanger yourself, you betrayed your entire squad. Cowardice was the worst crime imaginable. In fact, if you came back from battle without your shield, it meant you ran. The famous Spartan mother's farewell was, "Come back with your shield or on it." Warm and fuzzy, right? And if you think peace was a relief, not so fast. The Helots, enslaved people who worked the land, outnumbered the Spartans by as much as 10 to 1. So the Spartans declared war on them every year to keep them in check. Part of training for young Spartans included going out at night and, well, let's say removing threats. Yeah, it's as bad as it sounds. So, could you survive in Sparta? Only if you enjoy starvation, beatings, zero comfort, and dedicating your entire existence to a state that expects you to kill and die on command. It was hardcore, relentless, and utterly devoid of mercy. But hey, great abs. So, you've survived a night in a mud brick home in Athens, or worse, a Spartan barracks. You're tired, smelly, and aching in places you didn't know existed. Now you're hungry. But before you fantasize about flaky baklava or roasted lamb with herbs, let's set the record straight. The ancient Greek diet was humble. And by humble, we mean depressing. Forget butter, sugar, or anything with a fancy sauce. You're not eating for pleasure, you're eating to survive. This is the original Mediterranean diet, sure, but stripped of all the good stuff. There's olive oil, barley, olives, and maybe some goat cheese on a good day. But meat, rare. Spices, too expensive. Dessert, get real. Let's break it down by meal, starting with breakfast. If you're in Athens, your day starts with akratisma, a delightful bowl of barley soaked in diluted wine. That's right, wine for breakfast. Not because you're a party animal, but because the water's likely contaminated. No eggs, no toast, no milk. If you're lucky, you might get a fig or some stale bread to chew on while pretending it's a croissant. Lunchtime isn't much better. It usually involves maza, a dense barley cake that tastes like a dry sponge had a baby with a brick. You might also have a few olives, a dollop of soft cheese, and maybe some lentils or boiled greens if you're rich or it's a feast day. Now, if you're in Sparta, oh boy, forget everything you know about flavor. Spartan warriors were famously fueled by black broth, melissomas, a dish so horrifying that even other Greeks made fun of it. Ingredients: pork blood, vinegar, and salt. That's it. It looked like motor oil and tasted worse. When an outsider asked for the recipe, a Spartan reportedly replied, "To enjoy our broth, you must first bathe in sweat."
And don't expect second helpings. Spartan dining halls were communal, strict, and portion controlled. There were no snacks, no seconds, and no dessert unless it came from a conquered village. Dinner was slightly better if you lived in a wealthier polis. You might get some fish, vegetables, or a bit of honeyed fruit. Meat was rare and usually only eaten during religious festivals or sacrifices. In fact, most of the meat consumed was sacrificial leftovers. You watched your dinner get slaughtered for the gods, then roasted over an open fire, and then shared it with hundreds of other people. Not exactly intimate dining. Speaking of religion, every major feast or celebration involved food. But here's the catch: you had to earn it.
That meant fasting before festivals, walking long distances to the temple, participating in rituals, and possibly offering your best goat to Zeus. The gods ate well. You got scraps after the priests were done. Even cooking tools were limited. Most homes didn't have a kitchen as we know it, just a hearth, some clay pots, and maybe a grill plate if you were fancy. Seasonings were minimal: oregano, thyme, and lots of garlic. So much garlic. Enough to ensure your breath could kill a centaur. And what about sweets? There were a few. Honey was the only sweetener available, so if you were lucky, you might score a piece of melituda, a simple honey cake, or a bite of dried fruit. But sugar wouldn't be discovered for another 1,000 years, and chocolate? Non-existent. Your only dessert might be a fig and a silent prayer to Hermes for something tastier next season. As for drinks, wine, and more wine. But not like today's smooth Merlot or chilled white. Ancient Greek wine was thick, strong, and always diluted. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric. And don't forget, no coffee, no tea, no lemonade. You're stuck with sour wine, questionable water, or goat's milk, which wasn't exactly Instagram-worthy. Eating out? That concept barely existed. There were public taverns and food stalls, but they were lowbrow and mostly for the working class or foreigners. Respectable citizens ate at home or with the gods, not among the riffraff. If you were caught hanging around a tavern too often, you might be branded a glutton or worse, un-Athenian. So could you survive the ancient Greek diet? Technically, yes. Would you enjoy it? Not a chance. Your taste buds would beg for exile, your stomach would riot, and your idea of a cheat day would be a slice of bread that wasn't moldy. Welcome to the diet plan that makes medieval gruel look gourmet. Hope you like olives. So, you think gender roles today are tough? Strap in, because in ancient Greece, being a woman meant playing the longest game of hide-and-seek history has ever seen, and you're always it. If you think you'd be an empowered queen sipping wine at symposiums, think again. More like stuck behind a curtain praying no one asks you to do math. Let's start with Athens, the supposed cradle of democracy. Women had zero political rights. They couldn't vote, own land, or even appear in court without a male guardian. In fact, women were expected to stay indoors most of the time, literally. The ideal Athenian woman was one the public never saw. If you were out and about too often, people assumed you were either a prostitute, a slave, or a troublemaker, and probably all three. Life revolved around the gynecium, the women's quarters in the house, tucked away like an embarrassing family secret. Here, you'd spend your days weaving, spinning, raising children, and preparing food. Going outside? Only for religious festivals, funerals, or fetching water, and even then, you'd better be veiled and escorted. Eating out? That concept barely existed. There were public taverns and food stalls, but they were lowbrow and mostly for the working class or foreigners. Respectable citizens ate at home or with the gods, not among the riffraff. If you were caught hanging around a tavern too often, you might be branded a glutton or worse, un-Athenian. So, could you survive the ancient Greek diet? Technically, yes. Would you enjoy it? Not a chance. Your taste buds would beg for exile, your stomach would riot, and your idea of a cheat day would be a slice of bread that wasn't moldy. Welcome to the diet plan that makes medieval gruel look gourmet. Hope you like olives. So, you think gender roles today are tough? Strap in, because in ancient Greece, being a woman meant playing the longest game of hide-and-seek history has ever seen, and you're always it. If you think you'd be an empowered queen sipping wine at symposiums, think again. More like stuck behind a curtain praying no one asks you to do math. Let's start with Athens, the supposed cradle of democracy. Women had zero political rights. They couldn't vote, own land, or even appear in court without a male guardian. In fact, women were expected to stay indoors most of the time, literally. The ideal Athenian woman was one the public never saw. If you were out and about too often, people assumed you were either a prostitute, a slave, or a troublemaker, and probably all three. Life revolved around the gynecium, the women's quarters in the house, tucked away like an embarrassing family secret. Here, you'd spend your days weaving, spinning, raising children, and preparing food. Going outside? Only for religious festivals, funerals, or fetching water. And even then, you'd better be veiled and escorted. Education? Forget it. Most Athenian women were never formally educated. While their brothers learned rhetoric and philosophy, girls were taught domestic skills, how to manage a household, mix bread dough, and keep quiet. The greatest virtue for a woman? Silence. A famous Greek saying put it bluntly, the best woman is the one least spoken of, either for good or ill. Yikes. Marriage wasn't romantic. It was a business deal. Girls were married off around age 14, often to much older men. Your father chose your husband, usually with zero input from you. Love? Optional. Dowries? Mandatory. Your job was to produce legitimate heirs and not rock the boat. You didn't even have your own name in most records. You were referred to as daughter of X or wife of Y. Your identity was always tied to a man. And let's talk about childbirth. With no painkillers, no sanitation, and very little medical knowledge, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. Many didn't survive. Those who did were often left to raise children with no help and few rights. If your husband died, you might be sent back to your father's house like a defective appliance. Now, let's switch gears to Sparta. Believe it or not, Spartan women had it way better by Greek standards. They could own land, inherit wealth, and speak their minds. Why? Because while the men were off playing war, women had to run everything else. Spartan girls were given physical training, encouraged to be strong and outspoken, and even wore short tunics. Scandalous. They married later, around age 18, and had more influence in the household. But don't romanticize it too quickly. Spartan women were still valued primarily for their ability to produce strong warrior sons. Their empowerment came from necessity, not ideology. And affection in marriage? Let's just say most Spartan couples spent more time with their comrades than each other. And speaking of affection, let's address the elephant in the andron, men's quarters, sex. In many city-states, male citizens openly took younger male lovers, especially during mentorship in the military or intellectual training. Women were often seen as vessels for reproduction, not passion. It was common for husbands to engage more emotionally or erotically with male peers while expecting their wives to quietly manage the home. You were expected to endure this with dignity. Then there were the hetairae, courtesans who could actually attend symposiums, speak intelligently, and enjoy male company. These women were educated, independent, and often held significant influence. But don't be too jealous. They were still legally marginalized and could never marry a citizen. Respectable women were kept far away from public life, while intellectual companionship was reserved for the socially unacceptable. As for slaves and foreign women, their lives were even tougher. Enslaved women worked as domestic servants, wet nurses, or prostitutes. They had no rights, no protections, and no hope of citizenship. So if you're dreaming of strolling through the Parthenon in a flowing white chiton, think again. You'd more likely be hunched over a loom trying to stay out of sight, praying your husband doesn't bring home another war story or another war wound. Independence? Non-existent. Autonomy? Only if you count the kitchen as your kingdom.
In ancient Greece, womanhood wasn't about choices, it was about confinement. And unless you were rich, lucky, or Spartan, you didn't get a seat at the table. You didn't even get in the room. If you thought modern-day celebrities had drama, you haven't met the ancient Greek gods. These deities were like a dysfunctional family reality show, with more lightning bolts, affairs, and public meltdowns. And guess what? You, poor mortal, were expected to keep them happy or else face their divine wrath. Spoiler, you wouldn't last a day in their world.
The ancient Greeks believed their gods were deeply involved in everyday life. But don't imagine benevolent, halo-wearing protectors. No, these gods were petty, jealous, vindictive, and often downright cruel. They got into drunken brawls, seduced mortals and gods, lied, cheated, and punished anyone who crossed them, often unfairly. Take Zeus, king of the gods. He was basically the ultimate frat boy. With a thunderbolt in one hand and a wandering eye in the other, he fathered countless children by gods, mortals, and sometimes animals. Yes, animals. His wife Hera was a jealous goddess who spent much of her time scheming revenge on Zeus's lovers and offspring. Their marital drama fueled entire mythologies. Then there's Athena, goddess of wisdom and war strategy. She's the one who sprang fully armored from Zeus's forehead. Talk about a headache. Athena was a fierce protector of Athens, but didn't suffer fools gladly. Insult her, and you might end up turned into a spider. Ask Arachne, the unlucky weaver. Poseidon, god of the sea, was the original temperamental artist. Friendly one moment, wrecking ships the next, just because he was annoyed. He once created the first horse just to spite Athena. Also, if you thought storms at sea were random, nope, they were Poseidon's mood swings. Hades ruled the underworld, but wasn't the devil figure we think of today. He was more a strict landlord, overseeing the realm of the dead with grim fairness. His biggest scandal? Kidnapping Persephone to be his queen, an event that explains the seasons but also sounds like an ancient version of staycation gone wrong. Worshipping these gods wasn't casual or just for good luck. It involved rituals, sacrifices, often of animals, festivals, and a lot of praying. If you forgot a prayer or botched a ritual, you might be cursed with bad harvests, disease, or just bad luck. No pressure. And it wasn't just the big gods. Every town, river, mountain, and tree had its own spirits and minor deities demanding attention. You might pray to Hermes for safe travel, to Demeter for a good harvest, or to Dionysus for a wild party. Miss a festival? Expect divine pettiness. Temples were the social hubs and power centers, but attending worship wasn't a casual Sunday stroll. You had to know the correct prayers, bring the right offerings, and often pay fees. Poor people often relied on community support or simple prayers. Also, oracles, those mysterious seers who spoke for the gods, were famous but ambiguous. Ever heard the phrase, "Beware the Ides of March"? That's a classic example of cryptic prophecy. Oracles gave riddles that could be interpreted any way, and misreading one might send you to war or exile. If you were unlucky enough to offend a god, expect a curse called a miasma, spiritual pollution that could only be cleansed by expensive purification rituals. Offenses included murder, disrespecting a temple, or even unintentionally killing an animal sacred to a god. The consequences? Ostracism, fines, or even exile. So, living in ancient Greece meant constantly walking on eggshells, except the eggshells were sacred, and cracking one might summon lightning from Zeus himself. You'd have to memorize complex rituals, appease dozens of unpredictable gods, and hope your neighbor didn't accuse you of impiety. In short, if you can't handle divine drama, best stay home, because the Greek gods didn't just watch from afar. They micromanaged your life, and they had terrible tempers. If you think fashion disasters are a modern invention, think again. Ancient Greek style might look elegant in statues or Instagram posts, but living through it, that's another story. It's basically the original one-size-fits-all that often didn't fit at all, and had you battling a laundry nightmare daily. Let's start with the basics. Your typical Greek wardrobe consisted of just a few simple garments. The chiton, a rectangular piece of cloth sewn up the sides and pinned at the shoulders. The himation, a large wool cloak draped over one shoulder. And for some, the peplos, a heavier folded-over garment usually worn by women. Sounds comfy, right? Wrong. These flowy robes had zero stretch, zero buttons, and zero zippers. Getting dressed meant wrapping and pinning fabric, hoping it wouldn't slip off at the worst moment, like during a battle, a public speech, or a date. Wardrobe malfunctions were not only embarrassing, they could be deadly if you were caught vulnerable in public. Oh, and forget pockets. Ancient Greeks had to carry their belongings in bags or simply tuck them awkwardly in folds of fabric. Not ideal when you're juggling coins, scrolls, and maybe a lucky charm. Men's chitons were usually shorter for ease of movement, especially for soldiers or laborers. But even then, running or working in long, flowing fabric was like trying to sprint in a parachute. Spartan men typically wore minimal clothing in training, but otherwise, everyone was wrapped in layers that could get heavy and hot, especially in the Mediterranean sun. Women's fashion had its own quirks. The peplos and chitons were pinned with large fibulae, brooches, which could be sharp and uncomfortable. If you weren't careful, you could prick yourself or someone else. Imagine a social event where people casually poke each other with giant pins. Footwear? Sandals were the go-to, but many Greeks simply went barefoot. In cities, streets were dirty, crowded, and full of waste, so going barefoot? A recipe for sore, infected feet, not glamorous. Hairstyles were another challenge. Men often sported short hair or curls, but beards were popular, and trimming them required skill. Women's hairstyles ranged from simple buns to elaborate braids decorated with ribbons, gold, or flowers. Keeping these styles neat required constant attention and a personal hairdresser, luxuries most didn't have. Makeup and personal grooming were tricky too. Men used olive oil to soften their skin and sometimes dusted themselves with white powders. Women used mineral-based powders and red ochre for cheeks and lips, but these weren't always safe. Lead-based makeup could cause poisoning over time, so looking good sometimes meant risking your health. Jewelry was popular but a double-edged sword. Gold and silver pieces displayed wealth, but thieves loved them too. Wearing expensive jewelry outside could mark you as a target for pickpockets or worse. And since ancient law enforcement was minimal, you were mostly on your own. Now let's talk about the social rules around fashion. In Athens, modesty was prized. Showing too much skin was scandalous. Women's clothing was designed to conceal rather than reveal. Men, on the other hand, could get away with more, especially athletes and soldiers who trained nearly naked. At festivals and religious ceremonies, special costumes were worn, often with symbolic colors and patterns. Getting the wrong attire could offend the gods or worse, land you in hot water with officials. And don't think you could just wash these clothes easily. Most garments were made from wool or linen, and laundry was a serious chore. Washing meant scrubbing fabric by hand in cold water, sometimes with abrasive ashes. The process was slow, hard, and usually done by women or slaves. So, could you survive ancient Greek fashion? Maybe, but it would take a lot of practice to master the art of wrapping, pinning, and balancing elegance with practicality. You'd need patience to deal with itchy wool, sharp pins, and sunburned feet, and courage to face public scrutiny if your robe slipped or your sandals fell apart mid-step. Ancient Greek fashion was a blend of style, symbolism, and survival. It looked effortless, but trust me, it wasn't.
When you hear ancient Greece, you probably picture democracy, the birthplace of voting, debates, and freedom. But before you start dreaming of peaceful town hall meetings and enlightened citizens, let's clear the air. Ancient Greek politics were more like a non-stop reality TV show with shouting, backstabbing, and occasional exile. You'd need nerves of steel, a thick skin, and maybe a bodyguard just to survive a day in the Athenian assembly. Athens is the poster child of early democracy, but their system was far from perfect or peaceful. Only free-born adult males were citizens, which means no women, no slaves, and no foreigners. If you weren't a white, male Athenian landowner, you were pretty much invisible in politics. The rest of the population? They labored, fought, and stayed silent. Every citizen had the right and obligation to attend the ecclesia, the popular assembly where laws were proposed, debated, and voted on. Sounds empowering, right? Until you realize these meetings were held outdoors in a huge amphitheater, packed with thousands of people yelling over each other. Forget microphones. If you weren't loud and charismatic, your voice was lost in the chaos. And these debates, they often devolved into shouting matches, personal insults, and accusations of corruption. Political rivals didn't just disagree, they destroyed each other's reputations. Public speaking skills weren't optional, they were survival tools. Sophists, the professional teachers of rhetoric, thrived because they could train you to twist words and sway crowds like a pro. If someone annoyed the assembly, they could face ostracism, a strange but effective political tool where citizens voted to exile a person for 10 years. The catch? No trial or crime needed. Sometimes, powerful politicians used ostracism to get rid of rivals before elections. Imagine being booted out simply because you were too popular or too hated. Corruption and bribery were rampant. Wealthy elites often manipulated the system by funding public projects, festivals, or even paying citizens to attend votes. Politics was a performance, and money bought front-row seats. Meanwhile, in Sparta, democracy was a joke. Spartan politics were ruled by a mix of kings, yes, two, elders, and a council called the Gerousia. It was a rigid oligarchy focused on military discipline and social order. No debates, no voting rights for regular citizens, and certainly no shouting matches. You followed orders, trained hard, and shut up. But don't assume Spartan politics were peaceful. Power struggles were secretive and brutal. Political opponents could be assassinated, exiled, or shamed into silence. Sparta's political system was less about freedom and more about control. Back in Athens, courts were another political arena. Trials were held publicly with large juries, sometimes hundreds of men, who decided guilt or innocence by majority vote. There were no lawyers as we know them. Citizens argued their own cases. It was loud, chaotic, and sometimes deadly. Punishments ranged from fines to exile to death. Religion also mixed with politics. Politicians often claimed divine support or consulted oracles to justify their actions. Offending the gods wasn't just a spiritual mistake, it could be a political disaster. So, would you last a day? You'd have to master public speaking, navigate personal rivalries, dodge slander, and maybe learn how to bribe a few influential people. The stakes? Your reputation, your freedom, or even your life. Welcome to ancient Greek politics, a gladiator arena of words, power, and drama, where democracy wasn't about peace and order, but survival of the loudest and boldest. Imagine living in a society where your status is decided not just by birth, but by the brutal fact of ownership. In ancient Greece, slaves were the invisible backbone of the economy and household, yet their lives were marked by hardship, fear, and complete powerlessness. If you think you'd last a day as a slave or even a servant, think again. Survival meant navigating cruelty, exhaustion, and zero legal rights. Slavery in ancient Greece was widespread and accepted. Slaves were prisoners of war, kidnapped foreigners, or even people born into slavery. No matter how you became one, your life belonged entirely to your master, who could buy, sell, punish, or reward you at will. Some slaves worked in fields or mines, but most were domestic servants, cooks, cleaners, tutors, or personal attendants. Though some slaves in wealthy households lived relatively comfortable lives, the majority faced brutal conditions. Slave owners had the power of life and death over their property, and punishments could be severe. Whippings, shackling, and hard labor were common. Runaway slaves were hunted down, sometimes tortured, and executed as examples. Unlike citizens, slaves had no political voice or legal protections. They couldn't marry legally, own property, or testify in court. Their families could be separated at any time, sold to different masters without warning. Imagine the constant anxiety of not knowing where your loved ones might end up.
In some cases, slaves could be freed by their masters, a process called manumission. Freed slaves, called medics or freedmen, often remained socially marginalized. They couldn't vote or own land, but could work and live independently. Still, their former status hung over them like a dark cloud. It wasn't just slaves who lived under social shadows. Foreigners living in Greek city-states, called medics, had fewer rights than citizens and were often looked down upon. They paid taxes and served in the military, but were barred from political participation. So if you were born outside Athens, you'd always be a second-class resident. Even within households, servants occupied a liminal space, neither fully trusted nor fully despised. They did essential work, but were kept at arm's length socially. Their survival depended on careful obedience and sometimes cunning. So, would you last a day in ancient Greece as a slave or servant? Probably not without grit, luck, and a thick skin. You'd have no freedom, no security, and constant fear of punishment or separation from family. In ancient Greece, your worth wasn't measured by your character or skills, but by your status, citizen, foreigner, or slave. And if you fell into the bottom rung, you faced a harsh, unforgiving world. If you think school today is tough, imagine going to school in ancient Greece, where education was a privilege, a weapon, and sometimes a brainwashing tool all rolled into one. Would you last a day? Probably not, unless you loved memorizing poetry, arguing philosophy, and facing a teacher ready to smack you with a stick if you messed up. Education in ancient Greece was far from universal. Only boys from wealthy families, usually citizens, received formal schooling. Girls were mostly taught at home, focusing on domestic skills rather than reading or writing. So right away, if you weren't a privileged boy, you were likely left out. For those lucky enough to attend, school started early, around age 7. The curriculum was a mix of reading, writing, arithmetic, music, poetry, and physical education. The goal? To produce not just knowledgeable boys, but future citizens capable of public speaking, military service, and leadership. Memorization was king. Students learned epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey by heart, no textbooks or cheat sheets here. These stories weren't just entertainment, they taught values like courage, honor, and loyalty to the city-state. Physical education was equally important. Boys trained in wrestling, running, and gymnastics to prepare for military service. After all, Athens and Sparta both expected young men to be warriors as much as thinkers. Memorization was king. Students learned epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey by heart, no textbooks or cheat sheets here. These stories weren't just entertainment, they taught values like courage, honor, and loyalty to the city-state. Physical education was equally important. Boys trained in wrestling, running, and gymnastics to prepare for military service. After all, Athens and Sparta both expected young men to be warriors as much as thinkers. But don't think school was a nurturing place. Discipline was harsh. Teachers, called didaskalai, had the power to punish students physically. Think paddling with sticks or worse. Laziness or mistakes could lead to public humiliation, and there was no escaping the pressure to excel. On the intellectual front, students learned rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Since democracy demanded skilled orators, boys spent hours practicing speeches and arguments. This training was brutal but crucial. The ability to sway a crowd could mean power or exile. However, education wasn't just about facts or skills. It was also about loyalty. Schools indoctrinated students to value the city-state above all. You were taught to admire your polis, respect the gods, and obey laws without question. Questioning authority? Dangerous. In Sparta, education was even more militarized. The agoge system took boys from age 7 and trained them rigorously in survival, combat, and obedience. Individualism was crushed. Discipline and toughness were prized. Failure meant punishment or expulsion. Girls in both Athens and Sparta faced limited educational opportunities. Athenian girls learned weaving, cooking, and managing the household, while Spartan girls received physical training to be strong mothers of warriors. Either way, intellectual pursuits were mostly off limits. So, could you survive ancient Greek schooling? You'd have to memorize endless poetry, endure strict discipline, master public speaking, and swallow a hefty dose of patriotism. And if you were a girl or poor, you'd likely be excluded entirely. Education in ancient Greece was a rite of passage for some, a privilege for a few, and a tool for control and conformity. It shaped the minds and the futures of the city's elite, but left many others on the sidelines. If you think your diet is rough today, imagine trying to eat your way through ancient Greece. The food culture there was a mix of simplicity, scarcity, and weird traditions that might make your stomach revolt. Would you last a day surviving on this menu? Probably only if you liked olives, bread, and occasional fish, with a side of constant hunger. Ancient Greek cuisine was mostly based on what the land and sea could provide. Staples included bread made from barley or wheat, olives and olive oil, sometimes called liquid gold, cheese, wine, fruits, and vegetables. Meat was a luxury, usually reserved for festivals or the wealthy. Most people ate fish if they lived near the coast, but for many inland folk, protein was scarce. Breakfast was simple, usually bread dipped in olive oil or some leftover fruit. Lunch was light, maybe more bread, cheese, or olives. Dinner was the main meal, where families gathered to eat porridge, vegetables, and occasionally some meat or fish. Sounds boring? It was, but it was also nutritious for the time. Ancient Greeks loved their wine, but don't picture fancy cocktails. Wine was often watered down to prevent drunkenness. Drinking straight wine was considered barbaric, except maybe during wild parties hosted by Dionysus, the god of wine. The Greeks were pioneers of the symposium, a social drinking party for men where they discussed philosophy, politics, and poetry. If you weren't a citizen male invited to the symposium, you were excluded from the fun. These parties often featured music, poetry recitals, and lots of drinking games, but also plenty of debates and insults. Food preparation was mostly done by women or slaves. Cooking tools were basic: clay pots, open fires, and stone grinders. Preserving food was challenging without refrigeration. Salting, drying, or pickling were common methods to keep food edible longer. Sacrifices to the gods often involved slaughtering animals, and the meat was shared among worshippers in a communal feast. These religious meals were important social events, but not everyday fare for most.
If you had a sweet tooth, ancient Greeks had honey, nature's original sugar substitute. They drizzled it on cakes, fruits, and sometimes even meat. But sugary desserts as we know them didn't exist. Now, about hygiene. Eating with your hands was normal, but washing hands before and after meals was expected, sometimes with water poured from a jug. Using utensils like knives was common, but forks hadn't been invented yet. Eating out? Public taverns or kapeleia existed, but were mostly frequented by the poor or travelers. Food there was cheap and simple, but not always fresh or clean, so food poisoning was a real risk. Would you last a day? If you're used to fast food and snacks, probably not. Hunger, limited variety, and sometimes questionable hygiene might make you rethink ancient Greek cuisine. But if you're adventurous and can appreciate the humble olive, a sip of watered-down wine, and some hearty bread, maybe you'd survive. When you think of ancient Greece, you probably picture the Olympics, athletic competitions that still inspire the world today. But entertainment in ancient Greece went far beyond sports. From intense theater performances to wild festivals and lively music, Greeks knew how to keep busy. Would you last a day? Let's just say ancient Greek entertainment was not always for the faint-hearted. The Olympics were held every 4 years in Olympia, drawing athletes from all over the Greek world. Competitions included running, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and more. Athletes trained rigorously and competed nude, a tradition that might make modern spectators blush.
Winning meant glory, honor, and sometimes huge prizes. But losing could be brutal, especially in contact sports like pankration, an ancient mix of boxing and wrestling, basically no-holds-barred fighting. Outside the Olympics, city-states hosted their own games and festivals, often dedicated to gods like Zeus or Apollo. These events combined athletic contests, religious ceremonies, and communal feasts. Participating or watching was a big deal, a chance to honor the gods and boost civic pride. But sports were just one form of entertainment. Theater was huge in ancient Greece and still influences drama today. Tragedies by playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides explored deep themes: fate, justice, and human flaws. Audiences sat in large open-air theaters watching actors in masks perform emotional stories. These plays could be intense, and sometimes people took them very seriously, reacting loudly or even violently to controversial themes. Comedy was also popular, often bawdy and satirical. Playwright Aristophanes didn't hold back in mocking politicians, philosophers, and social norms. Imagine a 2,000-year-old version of stand-up comedy with crude jokes and sharp political satire. Music and dance were everywhere, from religious rituals to private parties. Greeks used lyres, flutes, and drums, and people sang along or danced in circles. Music was believed to have divine powers, capable of healing or inspiring warriors. Wine-fueled parties called symposiums were social highlights for Athenian men. These gatherings mixed drinking, intellectual debates, poetry, and sometimes scandalous behavior. Women and slaves were mostly excluded, except for entertainers like musicians or courtesans. Festivals could get wild. The Dionysia, dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, involved theatrical performances, parades, and drunken revelry. It was a time when normal rules relaxed and people indulged in pleasures before returning to everyday life. However, not all entertainment was benign. Gladiator-style combat wasn't Greek, but was common in later Roman times. Still, ancient Greeks enjoyed watching athletic fights, pankration, and competitions that sometimes resulted in serious injury or death. Spectators cheered for blood, glory, and spectacle. Would you last a day? You'd need stamina to keep up with all the physical contests, patience to sit through multi-hour plays, and maybe a strong liver for the symposium's wine, plus a thick skin for the sharp political jokes and social commentary. Ancient Greek entertainment was a vibrant mix of sport, art, religion, and social bonding, full of energy, passion, and sometimes chaos. It was a world where gods and mortals came together to celebrate life's highs and lows in unforgettable ways.
If you think warfare today is chaotic, brutal, and scary, welcome to ancient Greece, where battle was a daily reality for many and survival was anything but guaranteed. Would you last a day in the phalanx? Probably not without serious training, grit, and a healthy dose of luck. Warfare wasn't just about brute strength. It was a complex mix of honor, strategy, and sometimes downright madness. The typical soldier was a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman equipped with a helmet, breastplate, shield, called a hoplon, spear, and sword. These guys fought in tight formations called phalanxes, where discipline was key. If one soldier faltered, the entire line could collapse, meaning your life literally depended on your neighbor's grip and your own steady footwork. Battles usually started at dawn and could last hours with fierce clashes of spears and shields. Injuries were common, and medics as we know them didn't exist. Wounded soldiers often faced infection or death after the battle. Retreat was sometimes possible, but often shameful. Greeks prized bravery above all, and fleeing the field could ruin your reputation forever. Then there were the naval battles. Think triremes, fast three-rowed warships crashing into each other with ram bows aiming to sink or disable enemy vessels. Crews had to row in perfect rhythm and fight off boarding parties, all while balancing on a narrow, unstable ship. Seasickness alone would knock many out before the battle even began. Warriors also followed a code of honor.
Victory was celebrated, but cruelty and pillaging could backfire, angering allies or gods. Sacrifices and prayers before battle were common. No soldier wanted to face the wrath of Ares, the god of war. But not everyone was a soldier. The non-combatants, women, children, elders, faced dangers too, including raids, famine, and displacement. Life behind the lines was harsh, with towns sometimes burned or looted. Sparta was the ultimate military machine. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 to start the agoge, a brutal training program focused on toughness, obedience, and combat skills. Spartan soldiers were feared for their discipline and endurance, but lived under strict social rules and constant readiness for war. Would you last a day? Unless you were born into it and trained since childhood, probably not. The noise, fear, blood, and sweat of ancient Greek warfare would overwhelm most modern folks. But for the Greeks, it was not just survival. It was their way of defining courage, loyalty, and honor. Ancient Greece was a world where gods ruled every part of life, where every mountain, river, and city had its divine protector, and the line between myth and reality was blurry at best. Would you last a day in a society where the gods were watching, judging, and sometimes downright meddling? Let's find out. Religion wasn't just a personal belief. It was woven into politics, social life, and even daily routines. The Greeks believed their gods lived on Mount Olympus, but these weren't distant deities. They were capricious, jealous, and highly involved in human affairs. Offend a god, prepare for disasters, plagues, or personal curses. Temples dotted the landscape, each dedicated to a specific god or goddess. People visited to pray, make offerings, or seek advice from oracles, mysterious figures believed to channel divine messages. The most famous oracle was at Delphi, where the priestess Pythia delivered cryptic prophecies that could influence entire city-states. Religious festivals were huge affairs, mixing worship, drama, and communal bonding. The Panathenea in Athens celebrated Athena with processions, sacrifices, and athletic contests. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates secret knowledge about life and death. But what exactly happened? No one outside the initiates knew. Sacrifices were central. Animals were slaughtered and parts burned for the gods while the rest was shared in feasts. This was a serious ritual, not a casual barbecue. Mistakes could anger the gods and bring misfortune. The gods themselves were complex characters with stories full of love, betrayal, revenge, and humor. Zeus, the king of gods, was powerful but also notorious for affairs. Athena was wisdom personified, but could be ruthless to enemies. Hades ruled the underworld, a grim realm where souls went after death, far from the glory of Olympus.
Belief in the afterlife was murky. The underworld was a shadowy place, not heaven or hell. Most souls lived a dull existence, with few rewards or punishments unless they were heroes or villains. Religious devotion wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Failing to honor the gods could isolate you socially and politically. During crises, leaders often turned to religion to explain and fix problems, sometimes blaming enemies for offending the gods. Would you last a day? You'd have to navigate endless rituals, interpret confusing omens, and constantly watch your behavior to avoid divine wrath. A single misstep, an insult, a broken statue, or disrespect at a festival could ruin your life. In ancient Greece, religion was more than faith. It was a force shaping everything, from politics and war to art and daily chores. Living there meant living under the watchful, unpredictable eyes of gods who were both protectors and potential tormentors. So, you've heard the stories, the brutal social hierarchies, the relentless schooling, the scarce food, the blood-soaked battlefields, and the unpredictable gods. But what if you actually woke up, blinking in the Mediterranean sun, and found yourself transported back to ancient Greece? Would you last a day? First off, your modern comforts would vanish. No smartphone to check, no easy medicine, no central heating or air conditioning.
Instead, you'd face an intense world of smells, sounds, and sights unlike anything you're used to. The narrow stone streets bustle with merchants shouting over the crowd, animals wandering freely, and the ever-present aroma of cooking fires mixed with the less pleasant stench of open sewers. You'd have to quickly learn your place. Were you a citizen, a medic, a slave, or a woman? Each status came with strict rules and limits. As a citizen male, you might attend the assembly, but you'd also face military training and heavy expectations. As a woman, your days would mostly revolve around managing the household with little freedom outside. As a slave, freedom would be a distant dream. You'd work hard and live in fear. Food might surprise you. Simple bread, olives, and cheese dominate, with meat reserved for special occasions. Drinking wine watered down for moderation would challenge your modern palate, and washing hands before meals would become a ritual. You'd attend school if you were a privileged boy, memorizing epic poems under the stern gaze of your teacher and learning to speak publicly. Or you might be pulled into military drills that test your endurance and courage, especially if you're Spartan. Religion would be unavoidable. Every act might require a prayer or offering, and you'd keep a wary eye on omens and signs, knowing that offending a god could have dire consequences. Entertainment might shock you with its rawness, violent sports, dramatic tragedies, and symposiums filled with heavy drinking and philosophical debates. By sundown, you might be exhausted, physically and mentally drained by the relentless demands of this ancient society. It's a world where survival depended on your status, skill, and ability to conform to strict social norms. Would you last a day? Most likely, no. But understanding these challenges offers a deeper appreciation for the resilience and complexity of ancient Greek life, and why their legacy continues to fascinate us today.